Hello everyone, this is David Luscombe, and we're now ready to go on to the next part of the Bhuiyan Variation. So if you haven't seen the first one, then go ahead and go back and watch the first video, because this video I'm going to go through the opening parts pretty fast since we already covered them. Alrighty, so we can see white, does have his lead in development. F4 is very good. And then we see Queen F3, C5. So in the previous video, we looked at Black playing A5 and then C5, but now we're going to look at C5 so Black doesn't waste any time with A5 and tries to go directly after White's pawn center. But White is not worried about it. He plays G4, Bishop E7, and Rook F2. So once again we have G4 and we have the Rook on F2. Then there's Knight to D7, G5, and G5 is a really great clearance sacrifice. So now the queen moves out to H3, and there is this threat of checkmate. So F5 could be tried to stop that. And then if that happens, then play Knight D to F3, and if G4, well, we'll look at G4 in a minute. What happens if Rook out to F6 here? So White's idea of playing the knight out to F3 is simply to play knight takes G5, reinforcing the idea of Queen H7 checkmate. So if Rook out to F6 is played in order to try and play Rook out to H6 and stop this idea, then simply F takes G5, Bishop takes, and we're able to win the Rook there. So this is quite good for White. So what happens if instead of Rook out to F6, what about G takes F4? Well, then there is this knight to G6 hitting the Rook, and once the Rook moves in, Queen H8 check, King F7, Knight G5, King takes G6, and Queen H7, followed by Rook G2 checkmate. So that is pretty cool. So that's a pretty long checkmate there. So one idea is for White, of course, to take here on G5. And the other idea is to play knight out to G6. So let's look at the mainline variation where Black plays G4. Well, if that happens, then White can simply take here on G4, and Black cannot take back. If so King F7 would be the main line. But let's take a look at what happens if the knight is captured. Then we have Queen H7 check, Bishop check, King F6. Knight out to E5, a really cool quiet move, simply defends the bishop, so that way Queen to H4 would be checkmate. So here, if Rook out to H8 is played, then Knight takes G4, King E7, Queen takes checkmate, and if, so after Knight E5, if Rook G8, then Queen H4 is checkmate. After Knight E5, if Bishop takes on E5, so that way the bishop on G6 is not defended by the knight, then simply taking back with the pawn, double check, king moves back here, and Queen G7 is checkmate. And if the king were to move here, then Queen to H5 would be checkmate. So this is pretty cool. So this is a really cool variation of what also can happen in the Bhuiyan variation. Let's take a look at it. If King F7 is played after knight takes on G4, if King F7, then we have Queen H5 check, King E7, Knight G to E5, and after it captures, we'll take back with the pawn, play the queen out to G6, and simply go after the G7 pawn. So Queen G8 is played, then Rook G2, Rook H7 is played to defend it, but then Queen G5 check, and Knight H4. So now the idea is to potentially place a knight here, and threaten checkmate, or even better is bishop takes, pawn takes, and knight takes. Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and see that variation after queen to F7, bishop takes, pawn takes, knight takes, and there is this threat of check picking up the queen. The king cannot run over because the queen's guarding in that square. And if the king were to run this way, then we have rook out to F1 ideas, which would pin the queen to the king. And once again, in these Bhuiyan variations, we see that the bishop here on B7 is a passive bystander and is not able to really do anything to help out the black king.